I joined the company when there were 900 people. I left the company when there were 90,000 people. The first thing you got to do is figure out what markets you're going to go after first. The most effective resource that any sales leader can have is a sales planning and operation person. Early days, it was no revenue. And then when I left, it was close to $1 billion for the year. What makes me a little bit different than other sales leaders is I do have a focus on cost, the bottom line, not just top line. And that's always been my story to grow the team. Culture is everything. If you have the right people there and they're there for the right reason, then we can make pivots when it comes to new products or something not working or a competitor. When you start to build a sales team, don't just start hiring willy-nilly based on where you currently have customers. You got to figure out where your opportunity is and invest for that opportunity. That's the playbook, where while the team was 150 people when I moved on after 4 years, it didn't get there on day one. That was incremental growth along the way, and we needed to prove the value of every resource that we were given in order to get more. I was really proud that more than 50% of my leadership team were female.
Behind the scenes, it was a small group of people that were doing everything.
I want to know how this insane growth actually happened.
Quick message to highlight a GTM fund portfolio company that is crushing it. User evidence. 67% of sellers have watched a deal slip through their fingers because they couldn't provide relevant, specific customer proof. User evidence is helping the teams at Gong, Ramp, Splunk, and many more avoid this fate. User evidence is the customer evidence platform for go-to-market teams that makes it easy to collect customer feedback throughout the customer lifecycle, curate the best proof points, and share it with your go-to-market team to use. When asked about how Gong uses user evidence, Udi Ledegor, chief evangelist at Gong, who is also part of the GTM Fund community network, said, user evidence helps Gong showcase the value our platform provides by generating high-quality customer proof. With the ability to scale content creation, we can dedicate more time to enabling our sellers and building relationships with advocates. Trust is everything, and your customers are the best source of trusted feedback. Highly recommend you check out User Evidence, the customer evidence platform. You can do so at userevidence.com/GTM now. That's userevidence, all one word, .com/GTM NOW. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back to the GTM podcast. This is your host, Sophie Bonacisi, and I am joined today by Rick Kelley. Rick is the former managing director of Meta Ireland, where he spent over 15 years building and scaling sales and business operations. He launched Meta's EMEA business from scratch, eventually growing it to a 900 million plus operation, and later took that playbook global, actually helping to scale Meta's gaming and monetization business to over 11 billion. Rick, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sophie. Good to be here and excited to talk to your audience. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you joining us. And you've got an incredible story, which we're going to jump into around, growing and scaling organizations in EMEA and globally. But to kick us off, I almost want to start at the beginning, because you're initially from Boston. If you take us back, what was that moment and opportunity that set you on this path to building Meta's EMEA sales organization?
You're right. I am from Boston. I had spent some time in high school and college down in Pennsylvania. I came back to the Boston area after I graduated from school. And, I started in a sales career at FedEx, the shipping company. And I was going on to shipping docks and talking about how many packages they ship every day and things like that. And, I did pretty well at that for a couple of years, but also recognized that might not have been the most exciting thing for me, the things that I was interested in. It was probably around 2000 when I saw the internet just absolutely blowing up. And Boston's a tech capital. It's a tech hub, maybe not as big as San Francisco, but there's a lot of tech companies there. And Lycos, which was one of the first search engines, was located outside the Boston area. And I went to go sell advertising solutions for them. And I really enjoyed, matching the audiences that were on Lycos's platforms to what an advertiser was looking to do to sell their products. So I enjoyed the job, but Lycos was struggling, and it was the internet bubble had just burst. And I was thankful to have Yahoo actually come to the Boston area and set up their national sales team for mid-market. It was tier two brands, agencies, and things of that nature. So, in 2002, I went to go and work at Yahoo. And, I had a little bit of experience, obviously, in the internet advertising world from my time at Lycos. So quickly, did pretty well, became a manager. And after a couple of years, you got to find that thing that you can gravitate to and that you can own. And one of the things that I, had responsibility for was all the hiring, onboarding, training of new sales reps that came in through the door. And then we would deploy them onto different teams. And so I gained a reputation for being able to build organizations, find talent, develop talent pretty well. And so when they were looking to build something like that in Europe, I was on the short list of names within the company to go and do that. So you ask, how does a guy from Boston get to Meta in Europe? I was with Yahoo, and that brought me to Barcelona. I set up an international centralized sales team in Barcelona for Yahoo's advertising services. And it was interesting, because I was completely a different sales channel than anything in Europe was used to at Yahoo. And so you have all these commercial directors in every country, and they were responsible for every account in the country. And then here comes this American guy coming over to Barcelona saying, okay, now you guys are going to only manage the top 200. We're going to manage all the SMBs in the mid-market. You need a named account list, all the things that we're comfortable with in a go-to-market world around sales channels and efficiencies and so forth. And I was the young guy, 31 or 32 years old at the time, telling him, no longer are you going to do that. It's going to go this way. And I had the backing of leadership, but I really had to become, go from being a boy to a man pretty quickly to have some of these pretty tough conversations and to really restructure how the sales organizations were being managed at the time. So I guess, to get to the point of how did I get to Meta? After a couple of years of doing that at Yahoo, kind of again, Yahoo was probably struggling a little bit more in Europe, probably than other parts of the world at that time. Google had its dominance. And then there was this thing like social media was becoming a thing. And I took the phone call about them wanting, it was a buddy of mine that was running Europe for Facebook and said, hey, Rick, we're going to put a team in Dublin. Would you be interested in coming and basically building out a sales channel for EMEA? Again, more in the mid-market segment, the tier two brands and so forth. And then I said, look, 2.5 years in Barcelona. I've had a great run there. My wife and I had a blast. We had our first child there. But let's maybe move to a little bit closer to the Boston area, which is Dublin. There's a 5.5-hour flight for us to get home. My last name's Kelley, so I kind of already belong here. And, Facebook was, again, really starting to be a thing. And I said, yeah, let's get on this rocket ship.
That's incredible. And you currently reside in Ireland with the family, right?
I've loved it so much. We've stayed. So I worked at Meta for a little over 14 years, or Facebook, I guess you could say. But now we've got 2 kids. They're teenagers. They're in, high school. Our whole lives have been here for the last, we've been in Europe now for almost 20 years. And so this is home. And while, we still have a place in Maine, so we go back and forth on a regular basis for the most of the summer and holidays and things like that. So we have a good connection between home and here. But truthfully, this feels more like home now than anything else.
That's beautiful. Well, incredible place. And if anyone is going to Ireland, Rick is the person for recommendations.
Look, you can golf all year round. There's no snow. It's a little bit of the escape from some of the craziness that you're seeing in the States. It's a fun place to be. And the people are friendly. The Guinness is good. And you can go skiing in the Alps 2 hours away. You can go to the beaches of Spain 2.5 hours away. There's so much culture and food and different communities. It's a great place to live and to raise kids. And I feel really, really privileged to have to be able to have this experience in my life.
Incredible. And take me through the early days of building out the EMEA sales organization. How did you think about sequencing for hires, or what did that first step look like when you got the phone call, you made the move, you're in seat? What does that look like now?
Well, I joined the company when there were 900 people.
Wow.
I left the company when there were 90,000 people. So there were no playbook to go by, or, it wasn't like I was joining something and then having to refine it. It was, hey, Rick, go figure it out. And, I had great people around me to help me do that. I wasn't here alone and, all by myself by any means. But the first thing you got to do is figure out what markets are you going to go after first? Should I hire 5 people for the UK, or 5 people for France, or, how do I, in a limited resource and limited headcount way, how do I go about, choosing the allocation of different headcount? And so one of the things we did in the early days was create an economic study utilizing probably 7 to 8 different characteristics. What is our user base? What's the global total ad revenue, online ad revenue? How many users does Facebook have in those countries? And we kind of weighted them all and came up with a score for every country. So that meant that if I was given 150 heads, I would know the order of which I would go and hire them. I'm going to hire my 5th person in the UK, then my 1st person for the Nordics, and then my 3rd person for, France, whatever it was, so that if my boss had given me 18 new heads, 28 new heads, 38 new heads, I'm not saying, I don't quite know how I'm going to use them. I'd say this is exactly how I'm going to use them, and here's how much revenue I can actually forecast as a result of this, study that we did over a 3-month period. So I think the lesson in the early days is when you start to build a sales team is, you don't just do the finger in the air and just start hiring willy-nilly based on where you currently have customers. You got to figure out where your opportunity is and invest for that opportunity. I think the nice part about being in a centralized sales team like in Dublin or Barcelona or London, wherever, is that you can also move headcount around based on where you're seeing traction and needs and things like that. And a good example of that is maybe we overinvested in account managers and we needed more salespeople. Well, then you can move some people around based on the skill sets that you needed. Or in 2012, we started seeing gaming become this massive revenue stream for the company. It ended up being 15% of the company revenue back in 2012, 2013, when everybody was getting a smartphone and had an iPhone or an Android and people were playing games and downloading games. It was a boom to the company. And so one of the things that my boss had decided to do was pull gaming out of the regional structure and create a 5th region for the company, which was gaming. So you've got North America sales, Latin America, EMEA, APAC, and gaming. So it was treated as the 5th region. And because I had a pretty sizable portfolio of gaming companies in my EMEA mid-market team, she asked me to take that global role on. And the next 10 years meant me growing that business out from Dublin.
And we want to go down that route. I have so many questions about the gaming business itself. But even before we get there, you built out very intentionally this plan. And that way you had a good idea of exactly which countries and who you would hire for and that prioritization framework. If a startup, for example, or a company is looking to expand into EMEA now, would you recommend that similar playbook? Or would you recommend any kind of adaptations to it?
So when I came to interview for the Yahoo role, and I'm going to go back now a couple of years.
Yeah.
I wrote a 39-page PowerPoint presentation on how I would go and build the European mid-market sales team for Yahoo. I had been doing it. I didn't need to do that. I thought that I had to woo the boss and make sure that I showed up prepared, not realizing that he was kind of trying to get me, to make the move across the pond. But my point is that I had a plan and I created it, and everything from how we're going to recruit, the timeline of when we're going to have people at desk, time to prospect, time to whatever activity we needed to do. And I absolutely think that if you're a startup or, starting to think about what your go-to-market playbook looks like, you need to figure out who are the constituents that you want to sell to. Is it partners? Is it agencies? Is it third parties? Is it direct customers, big customers, small customers? Lay it all out in a document of some sort. And then you start to put a plan around how do you address them? What's the timing to address them? What's the priority of maybe one channel versus another? And then, for Europe, I think or any international team, you have to think about what markets you go after. And you need a level of critical mass in those markets, because if you're only hiring one person to address Italy, if that person leaves, is ineffective, goes on maternity or paternity leave, you got to have a little bit of depth there in order to keep the market going. So these are all things to be very, very thoughtful about. And I don't think you always have to put people in the markets in order to be incubating a market. You might start that in a centralized team, get the activity moving. And after a year or two and the, revenue starts to be meaningful, then you can deploy a local office, because that creates a whole other set of, dynamics. You've got to have a legal entity. You've got to understand local HR laws, which are very different from France to Italy to Spain to Germany. And you can't just say, hey, we're going to hire in those markets and not have a good understanding of what that might mean if things don't work out in that market or if that person doesn't work out. So there's lots to be thoughtful for. And I think the more that you can get that on paper before you start to execute, you can see around corners better.
That's great advice. And like you said, there's a lot of different nuances to every single different country in EMEA. How would you recommend startups think about that distribution of sales reps, whether it's centralized or deployed in countries themselves across EMEA? Should it be a singular country focus, so one country at a time? Should it be distributed across a few different countries when you're looking to first come into EMEA?
It depends on the size of the startup. And a lot of what I do now, post my Meta World, is work with startups on their go-to-market. So this is a conversation that I feel like I have once a week, if not more. There's not a one size fits all, but I have a bias. And that bias is to be, how do you add optionality to your sales organization? Meaning, if you only have 4 people to hire and you think that it's one in the UK, one in France, one in Germany, I don't know, add another country there, I would rather see you be a little bit more thoughtful and say, let's put those first 4 people in a singular location where A, they can learn from each other. B, English is widely spoken across the business world, in EMEA, less so in certain countries. But, if you're having, if things are not as busy in France as you might have expected, a big competitor or whatever reason, you could always have that French person calling into Belgium where they speak French, or Switzerland where they speak French. Spain, for example, when we hired our first Spanish employees, they were also calling into Latin America because we didn't have a Latin American team at the time. So if you have them in the country and it's only 1 or 2 people, it's harder to gain that optionality and be able to move people's focus around. Another example in Southern Europe is everybody goes on holidays for all of August. But if your team isn't going on holidays, what more could you have them do so that they're not ineffective for 3 weeks and sitting on their hands? And so anytime I talk to a startup, I try and say, look, you don't have the resources to go put in, 35 people across the region. Let's be a little bit more thoughtful about how we can get more, from a limited resource there.
That's excellent advice. Yeah, I really look for those overlap areas. So you took us through your market segmentation of EMEA and where to focus first. Take us through what happened after that. So you've got your plan approved. What do the early execution days look like?
You've got to get the piping right. So how are we reporting on sales? How are we forecasting, goal setting? And in a world where you're going 0 to whatever, these things are a little bit more challenging to get right. So you got to set up a comp plan. You probably don't want to have an uncapped comp plan, or because, in the early days when your goal is $1 million in the first quarter, it's easy to come in at $1.5 million, and now you've come in at 150% of goal, and you're paying out ridiculous amounts of money to your sales team. Similarly, you might have over forecasted and you only come in at 75% of goal, and you don't want your whole team to be hurt. So let's look at a comp plan that works for the company and a comp plan that works for the sales or the team itself. Then you've got to figure out, like, operationally, sales ops, how do we distribute the goal? How do we forecast? How are we looking at the pipeline? So I think the most effective cross-functional resource that any sales leader can have is a sales planning and operation person that is focused on that segment of the business. So, as my career developed and, became more influential with different cross-functional partners from marketing to sales engineering, so on and so forth, my number one partner has always been that sales planning and operations, the CFO of my organization, if you would, because they're going to help you create investment cases, figure out if your investments are working, how are they paying off, because there's nothing easier to go and ask for, more money to go and grow the team when you can say, this is what you gave me 6 months ago. Here's what I've done with that. Give me this, and then I can do this as well, right? Like that's the playbook where, while the team was probably 150 people large, give or take, when I moved on to gaming in 2013, after 4 years, it didn't get there on day one or day, first, second year or third year. That was an incremental growth along the way. And we needed to prove the value of every resource that we were given in order to get more. So that's always to me, it's about, don't just think about the salespeople or account managers that need to be at desk. What other key roles or leaders do you need to help you tell the story and write the right story? The other thing I would say, as the guy coming in to start the team, doesn't mean that I was the manager of every person within it. So you've got to hire good leaders, and you've got to invest in people that are going to be able to do the job in 18 months time when maybe the team goes from 10 to 30 people. Are they still capable of leading the 30 people that, so hire ahead of maybe where you think the team is going to go, because the last thing you want to do is layer somebody after, a year or two, because the job has just got too big for them. So how can you sell the vision to people that are like, yes, the team is maybe only 10 people now, but here's what I need you to do over the next 18 months. And that team's going to look like this. And if they can come on that journey, then that's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you essentially, it's almost like incubating a startup within a larger organization. You really built it from zero.
100%. That's a great way to describe it. It's like nobody in Menlo Park back in the day, or Sunnyvale, in the Yahoo days, knew anything about the team that I was, developing. But once you start to, get the team in place at desk and putting numbers on the board, then all of a sudden they're saying, whoa, let's have another look at this.
And when building out that leadership team and being really thoughtful about those hires, were you prioritizing certain skill sets around expansion into EMEA? So people who had already run that playbook before, or did you find that wasn't necessarily a characteristic or trait or experience area that you had to prioritize?
Yeah, I think back in the day, I tried to prioritize language skills. So I probably over pivoted to that. And then rolled that back. I ended up rolling it back where how can I get good managerial and leadership talent, even if they don't speak the language, to be the directors. And then maybe we could hire or develop the individual contributors to the point where they could be team leaders and more junior managers, and they speak the language of the local country, but that there's still some pretty senior talent above them to be able to, build out a proper go-to-market plan for that particular sub-region. And as you get bigger and as you get to be a certain level of scale, you do need to go from EMEA into Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, whatever the breakout might be, or vertical. You might say, you know what? Autos and travel and gaming, whatever, there's benefits to doing that too. So you got to sit down and you got to be able to spar with some other senior leaders to say, well, here's the pros and cons, and maybe here's why that wouldn't work. And having the right people around you to do that, I think, is one of the things that I would always advocate for. Even if they were a little pricey to come in because they were at a more senior level, in a year's time, you're going to need that seniority.
Mm-hmm. And how do you anticipate AI now impacting the potential global expansion and that emphasis on language abilities?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in AI making the world more efficient. No doubt about it. I think that there are tasks that take place within a sales functionality that AI is great for, like helping prospect, helping surface the right. I just got off a call today where, the tool itself, creates emails for prospects that helps identify prospects. It's like a Tinder for companies. They can swipe right or swipe left based on how good that prospect looks, to be a fit for the product that they're selling. There's a lot of things that they will do in terms of like business development efficiency, and I'm a big believer in that. But I also don't believe that it will replace building relationships, which I think is such a big part of sales. You could probably get a sale over the line just with an AI type bot or, utilizing some form of machine learning. But when things go wrong, people want to talk to people.
Definitely. And you mentioned the number 150. So 150 people when you left the organization to go build global. So you scaled, sounds like, from 0 to 150. What kind of time frame was that? And what kind of revenue was reflective of that too?
Yeah, so day one, there were two salespeople already at desk before I came. So I was number 3 coming in as the manager. And then, it was close to 150 when I then moved on, and that organization got moved into a different one. Early days, it was no revenue. And then when I left, it was close to $1 billion for the year. And what was funny is that we were like neck and neck with the North America team that was, similarly built, right, mid-market. And I can remember my boss saying, that has never happened before. Like, how is EMEA the same revenue as North America? And I was pretty proud of that. And I told that to the team because then the team wore that as a badge of honor as well. But the truth of the matter is gaming was a big part of that revenue piece of the pie. And, you could have Candy Crush, which is by King, now owned by Activision. They're sitting in London, but they want to advertise to every person around the globe. So, that might be in your region in EMEA, but that's a big advertiser. And so that's one of the ways that we got up to, 900 million pretty quickly after, it was about 3.5 years when we got to that point. So, yeah, so that's what, kind of part of the idea was incredibly efficient when it came to cost of sales, when it came to revenue per head. And I always really tried to, and kind of maybe what makes me a little bit different than other sales leaders is I do have a focus on cost, on, the bottom line, not just top line. And I like to be a really efficient sales channel and a really cost-effective one. And that's always been my story to kind of, grow the team.
And gaming took off. And so you actually spun off and grew and scaled from regional to global, taking it to ultimately 11 billion or close to that. What did that transition period look like going from regional to global?
I mean, it was a 10-year journey. So, when we first got started, we were a team of 36 people around the world, primarily Dublin. Singapore was a smaller team, and then San Francisco, and each of those hubs were for those regions. And much like I addressed the EMEA mid-market team, I started to think about, well, where do we want to have, people be located? What are the countries that we want to prioritize? So similarly, we started to look at, what are the biggest gaming markets in the world? Where are the biggest developers? Where do we need those language capabilities? Because while EMEA, can traditionally speak English pretty well across the different countries, APAC is not necessarily that way. A Korean person maybe would find it very difficult to speak, Japanese or English or something like that. And then that's not even talking about China, which is a whole other animal for us, because Facebook was not allowed to go into China. We weren't allowed to have an office there. We weren't allowed to sell to Chinese developers directly. So we had to set up a third-party channel that the sales would go through. And so how I built a team to service all of that was very different than any other market. And there was no playbook for that. We had to figure that out. So I think, in the early days, again, we went from 35 people. We had a really good cost of revenue. We got 15 headcount or so in that first year or two, which is still really small. I mean, we're still, at that point, a team of 50 people, but the numbers continue to grow and more people were playing games on their phones. And then all of a sudden, real money gambling like your DraftKings or Paddy Power and FanDuel and all those started becoming legal in the late, 2016, 17, 18. And so that led to more investment. Yeah, and the business just grew and grew wildly. And so from an ad perspective, we probably topped out in 2021 at around close to 6 billion. And then we ended up taking on, in my group, the whole ad network business for the company, which was putting third-party ads inside other people's apps. And that was, an equivalent size team. So, all in all, probably just under 12 billion between the two. And so that, now you're marrying two organizations, gaming and publisher sales and a third-party ad network. And how do you create synergies between them? Because there's a reason they've just put them all together as one. How do you go from 1 + 1 = 2 to 1 + 1 = 3 by bringing those orgs together,
What playbooks do you think were the most transferable from more of the regional EMEA sales org growth?
Culture. Culture is everything. So, who are the people that we want to hire? Who are the ones that we want to be on the team? I don't need the smartest people in the room ever. I want you to be hungry, have grit, figure out what motivates you and what motivates this person versus this. It can often be very, very different things. And, a good manager has to understand that and be able to play into, motivating, through that. And regardless of where it is around the world, like my playbook is always to think about culture first. And then, an old boss of mine used to say, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's true. It's like if you have the right people there and they're there for the right reason, then we can make pivots when it comes to new products or pivots when it comes to something not working or a competitor starting to rise up and become a threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine that would be particularly important as you're trailblazing new areas and really building that out globally.
Well, yeah. And, I think what was really cool about gaming is we were our own team on the side. So you might be sitting in the Singapore office, but you weren't a part of the APAC team. You were part of the gaming team. So, we didn't have as many resources as maybe they did when it comes to cross-functional team members, even things like T&E. But we wore that, pride on our sleeves, and we prioritized fun. How can we have it be fun? I've got a colleague in, if I'm in Singapore, I've got a colleague in Tel Aviv because there's a whole team there. And I've got a colleague in New York City. no real other teams across the company had something like that. And so one of the things that I started doing in 2015 was bringing anybody that touched gaming in the company to someplace around the world, and have a massive summit where we went through, the whole priorities for the next coming year, how the business results looked, where our investments were going to be. And it got everybody on the same page. Whether you were directly part of my team or a cross function, you all felt like you were part of something bigger. And again, that's kind of what I, come back to when I talk about culture is how, you're on different comp plans or what have you, but how do I really make you feel invested in what we're trying to do in gaming? So a couple of years, we did Dublin, we did Austin, Texas, because we had a decent sized team there. We did Singapore. We just picked a different place where we had a fairly sizable presence, and we brought everybody, like up to 450 people, getting on a plane and spending 3 days at a summit. And it really helped connect people and helped, create a community, really a community.
Definitely. And how did you test for culture? It's something that I think everybody's always trying to figure out different ways of doing so. And you've obviously done an incredible job of hiring for culture fit.
I mean, you have cultural health surveys and indexes, and it tells you where you're doing well, and it tells you the things that, you got to get better on. And so we'd listen to the feedback. We'd put plans in place to hopefully close the gap. Some things we could never really close the gap on, whether it's compensation where people are underwhelmed by, or, hey, I want to be, a VP in the next 6 months. How do I get there? And it's like, well, you're 2 years out of school. That's probably not realistic. There's all these expectations that people have that maybe you can't match, but you can listen, you can address them, and you can, hopefully incrementally improve, even if it doesn't get to people, all the way where they are. But at the same time, it's like, are they staying within the team, or are they looking to transfer out to a different organization? You're looking to go from gaming to entertainment, which will put you back in the North America team or back in APAC team. And if people were still coming to us from those teams, as opposed to our team going to those teams, then I knew we had a pretty good thing. And when things weren't right, look, it's not all roses over a 10-year period. You had some leaders that, rubbed people the wrong way or were ineffective. You don't get every hire right. I think one of the things that maybe makes me a little bit different is that I do tend to give a little bit longer leash and help and try and develop my senior leadership team, or even, the next level beneath them, give them a chance to improve if things aren't working right, right off the bat. Sometimes you've got to cut bait and know when to call it a day. But I think other leaders maybe would do that a little bit more quickly. And I try and develop these people and care about their careers,
That's fantastic. And I mean, you've grown regionally, the business, you expanded globally. If you could kind of look back in that reflective mirror, what are some of the things that you think you did really well? What did you do right?
We hired great people that knew the industry, that still today are phenomenal at their jobs. The average sales rep in our organization managed about $40 to $50 million a quarter, whereas that might be 10x what someone on the FMCG team or a different team would manage. So the scale of the revenue that our men and women were managing was significant. And so hiring, I'm very proud of that. I'm proud of also how we did it with diversity as a priority. One of the things about gaming is it's a very male-dominated industry. Only 23% of industry professionals are female. And so, we were looking at ways as how can we build diverse teams? And part of that was driving more women into looking at the careers that the gaming organization could provide to them. And that was not an overnight thing. We had to put a lot of work into that between my marketing counterparts to really put a plan to, at every industry function, we would have a woman in gaming leadership luncheon or breakfast, have the right guest speakers come in, have women tell their story. We had a whole presence on Facebook where 100 women told their story of how they got into the gaming industry and the pros, the cons, some of the challenges that they've had, because it was a learning opportunity. And more women would look to us as a place to grow their career. And I was really proud that at the end of the day, when I left, more than 50% of my organization were female, and more than 50% of my leadership team were female. And so 5 years ago, I don't think that I probably would have envisioned that. And it took a lot of hard work, but it meant that more than half the games out there now are being played by women. and games are being developed with women in mind. And so we need women to be able to talk to them about how you market to those folks, and be compassionate about even the characters that are being depicted within the games and how that might make a woman feel. And then that's not even to say that we had the whole trans community that also were, big employment opportunities to drive into our team. And so I was really proud at a lot of the pride efforts that we had, because diversity comes in many different forms. It's not male, female. It's not, particularly when you have a global team, it's not necessarily about hiring one underrepresented race or creed, because all these countries present different things. And so how can we really impact diversity? And that would be male, female, sexual orientation, things of that nature. So I'm proud at the end of the day that that's where we ended up.
You really built a ton of intentionality, Rick. And what would you say would be the things now, looking back, that maybe you would have done differently or good lessons learned along the way?
This is rather specific to me. What happened in gaming tend to happen in other categories and other verticals 10, 18, 24 months down the line. We were the beachhead when it came to advertising. Gaming advertisers are nimble. They are quick to find something that is effective when it comes to advertising. And so they were pushing us as a company to build products in the direction that we ended up doing that. But it also meant that, a big part of my job was being product literate and working with the engineering team to develop ad products that suited what our clients were looking for. That meant sometimes I'd get things really quickly because it sounded like a real, quick win. But it also meant some bigger things really got put on the back burner because I was the only one asking for them. So the learning that I probably have would be, how do I get other verticals into my request, into my product roadmap faster than maybe what I did? And I learned that over time, that I shouldn't be the only one shouting for these things, because if I'm asking for it now, travel, e-commerce, entertainment might be asking for it in 12 months' time. So let's build it before it's build it and they'll come.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I probably made a million different mistakes here or there, but that's always one that I reflect on, to say, bring more people into your requests, and then you're not alone asking for it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's phenomenal advice to anyone leading, to building in general.
Yeah.
And I always think failure is a data point. Mistakes are a data point.
Even the best baseball players fail 70% of the time, right? It's like, how do you have an impact, with the wins, and learn from the other areas and move forward?
You got it. Now, you've scaled gaming globally. What happens after that?
Well, in 2021, the investments that the company was making were starting to get pretty big in virtual reality, the glasses, the Oculus devices, now called the Quest. And so gaming was becoming a really big part of, we rebranded from Facebook to Meta. But that was very much a separate division, that whole virtual reality. And then my organization was, on the side. Part of that, though, was, the desire to, I was at that point a senior vice president, and they wanted to put more things underneath my responsibility that had a tie-in with gaming. And so they moved the ad network piece, and they combined that organization, the audience network, with our gaming piece. And we created some real efficiencies around that and created some new go-to-market, because we were basically, selling advertising, but then we were also paying those same companies because they were allowing us to put other ads within their gaming apps and non-gaming too, weather apps and utility apps, travel apps, whatever. So that was going well. And then, as if I didn't have enough to do at that point, my good pal, who was the head of Ireland, which is our international headquarters, he decided to leave the company. And so I was asked to take on that responsibility, which is now, supposed to be 25% of my job. But of course, it was a lot more than that. And so I still had gaming. I had the ad network piece, which was relatively new. And now this third component, which is leading the country in front of policymakers, in front of politicians. We're just trying to get people back in the office post-COVID. So we were actually consolidating a couple of offices into one new, bigger office, and trying to get people to come in, on their own accord, as opposed to being forced to come in at the time. So a lot of it was about culture development and sitting on the boards of these, 9 or 10 different meta corporations that were international. So, as you get into a role and you don't feel like maybe you're learning as much, what new responsibilities can you take on for the company? where you can leverage what you've learned and trying to develop your own, I guess, experiences even more. And I'm really thankful that I did that. Because one of the things with my role over the years, I was sitting in Dublin, but I was either pan EMEA or pan global, and my Irish contacts and my Irish, I guess, network probably suffered because I was everywhere else. I was never really focused here. And so by taking on that role over the last 18 months, I was really able to, create more of a community for myself locally. And that's now served me well, post leaving.
Incredible. And that whole journey at Meta has been over 14 years. And now you are advising a lot of and supporting a lot of startups. Is there a certain focal point, any specific vertical region that you're working with startups on?
I'm not exclusive to any one geographic area. I've decided that I didn't want to go back to work full time in an operational role, but at the same time, I'm young enough that I don't want to, twiddle my thumbs and cut the lawn every day. And how can I give back a little bit to the companies that are now starting to create themselves and, are looking to be the next billion-dollar companies? So at first, I started working with partners of Meta that were, building businesses on the back of it, either on the back of WhatsApp or on the back of being able to build creative that would be used on Meta in advertising purposes, because that's the world that I knew. And I knew, it was kind of an easy extension to start getting involved with those. But that led to becoming, a part of a group called Tech Operators here in Ireland, which is 30 senior level executives from the tech industry that invest and mentor and coach different startups. Most of them are Irish based. And so that means, a little bit more concentration there. But yeah, I just try and, I've written a thesis of where I do want to get involved, where I don't think I can add a lot of value. And I try and choose projects that will allow me to lean into those things.
But that leads us into actually our last two questions, which are always the same, Rick. And that is, what is one tactic or strategy that's working for the companies that you're advising right now?
Well, they're very early stage, all of them, like seed capital range. They're hiring their first 20, maybe their first 10 or 20 employees. And so, I think that I can add a lot of value when it comes to the go-to-market conversation, but it's also around culture, and that's, I think, a big part of what has made my career prosper is that I've focused, as we've been talking about, I've over-indexed on the culture piece. And so I've tried to really impart that with anybody that I'm speaking to around, do not underestimate how important those first hires are in your company, because they are going to be the ones that set the tone for everybody else that comes along the way. And they need to be able to share your vision and share your hard work and energy, or else it's going to be a house of cards that's going to fall down. So that's, I think, one of the things that I really evangelize is we could do different things with the go-to-market plan, and some need to look different than the others. But what's really important in every company is, how people feel about where they work and who they work for.
Definitely. And they're all nodes of impact, nodes of brand too. Find every touch point, every person's a reflection of that. Super valuable.
Yeah.
And if I flip that on its head a little bit, what's one widely held belief that you'd say revenue leaders hold that you kind of think is bullshit or no longer serving us?
I think a lot of people, when they're a sales leader, they say, I've got to have people in the market. I've got to have, if I'm the French country leader, I need to have everybody in France or, the UK or wherever it is. And, as we've talked about, I think that there's a real advantage for having people be centralized on behalf of the French market, but working alongside their German counterparts, their Spanish counterparts, because the knowledge learning that takes place is so much faster than if you are in an isolated, remote office where you're not as connected to headquarters, because everybody wants to come to a major headquarters like a Dublin or a London, from corporate headquarters and tell about their new product or tell about the new marketing narrative. And so quickly you get feedback and you get learning being taken place throughout the team. If you're just in an office of 7 or 8 people in Madrid, you're going to miss so much of that. And so one of the things that I really believe is that you can have a hub and spoke model where you might sit in Dublin for 3 weeks and then you go into the market for a week and you hit all your customers and you do, a trade show, whatever it is. And then you take those learnings back to Dublin and then you head back into the market a couple of weeks later. So I think that's one of the things. This is also this old adage that is, don't take no for an answer, right? That's sales. Be persistent, keep banging on the door. And I don't believe that that's true. I think that there's good business and bad business. A couple of examples, like if it's going to take you 8 months to close the deal and, a ton of cross-functional man hours and this and that, but you finally get it over the line, could you have gotten 3 other deals over the line if you didn't put all that time and effort into that one? Make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze, that the prize is big enough to allocate all those resources and effort and time. Alternatively, you've got pieces of business that may not be great pieces of business for your brand. An example from the gaming industry is that there was a lot of misleading gaming ads back in like 2018, and it was big revenue. It was like more than 400 million in ads that probably didn't depict gameplay like the actual game. The ad showed one type of game, and you weren't actually playing that game when you got to the game. I made the decision to shoot all that, get rid of it, create policies that doesn't allow that anymore, because the reputation that our users had with, oh man, I can't trust a gaming ad because I'm not really going to be playing a game like that. So people stopped responding to gaming ads, and it hurt the entire, category. So by basically saying, I don't want your money if that's the only way you're going to spend it, it hurt for, probably 6 months until we kind of cycled through it, but it improved the ad quality and our reputation with all of our users. And it was the right thing to do.
Sounds like you're really bringing that long-term mindset to everything like that, like the culture hires, really looking at that long-term build strategy as opposed to the short-term revenue hits or hires.
I suppose, yeah. I've never probably looked at it that way, but again, it's not about it chasing every last almighty dollar. It's about doing what's right for the company, doing what's right for the team, and so forth.
Definitely. Well, Rick, this has been fantastic. Really appreciate the time. And how can people find you if they want to get in touch or follow along your journey and content?
I'm on LinkedIn. Rick Kelley is with an EY is my LinkedIn address. I'm sure you'll put it in the show notes or in the
we sure will,
wherever. You could obviously find me on Facebook if need be. And I don't know. I'm around. I'm not tough to track down. That's for sure.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Rick. Really appreciate the time. To all the listeners,
and I hope this was helpful.
It was super helpful. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for hanging with us, and we will see you next week.